Like many people, I get tired sometimes of reading a large amount of stories that tend to feature very young people. There is certainly something useful about portraying a younger character, and I will talk about that later in the video. That being said, sometimes I just want to follow a main character in a story that is over the age of 22 and maybe even over the age of 32. Part of me wonders if so many books are published following younger characters because there are many younger readers. Who reads the most? It definitely can look like a lot of young people are reading if you are really deep into the reading social media world, especially when you look at genres like fantasy and romance. It seems to be a lot of young people talking about books online because a lot of these views from young content creators get lots of views. Due to that, I think in my head, I almost wondered if young people read a lot and if they were buying the majority of the books, so publishers choose to sort of cater to this crowd. As I started looking for a source that would give me information about how much each age group reads, I found it to be very difficult to find good information that I could actually trust because I could kind of see their methods. There was this one from the Pew Research Center that is outdated and almost not useful at this point, but I want to show it anyway because I found it funny. They were doing a survey to try to understand the habits of young people reading, and so they compare young Americans to older Americans. Young Americans get the age range of 16 to 29, and everyone who has hit 30 is grouped together as older Americans. So the first group is a group of people who span a little bit over a decade, and then the second group is everyone from 30 to death, because apparently that constitutes being old. I try to look for more recent sources because while that one is trustworthy and fun to look at, it still is from over a decade ago. I did find one that claims that the age group that reads the most is the millennial generation. And then I found another source that claims that the group of people who buy the most books are women over the age of 45. And these can definitely both be true because one is reading and one is buying, but I would take both of those with a little bit of grain of salt because I couldn't really verify the methods used in coming to those conclusions. Do keep in mind, though, that if it is true that the millennial generation are the most voracious readers, the youngest millennials right now are currently turning 30 years old, so apparently they're older Americans anyway. The literacy issue. Now, I also understand why we might focus on young readers, even if they aren't reading at a rate way higher than older people. And it has to do with just wanting people to be literate and wanting people to learn how to read, and publishing a lot of books that appeal to younger readers is positive because hopefully they become literate through reading books that they find fun. I feel like I have encountered so many older people in my life, and I'm talking people who are middle-aged and grandparents who are searching for books for the teenagers in their life because they want to promote literacy. This is obviously very important. While reading for fun statistics are hard to figure out, there are quite a few of good, valid literacy statistics for the United States because, I haven't really mentioned it on my channel, but we are in a little bit of a crisis as far as literacy goes. In 2024, 79% of Americans were considered literate, and 54% of Americans have a literacy rating below the 6th grade level. From this perspective, I totally understand why we want to get more young people into reading and why that is always such a huge communal focus, because we want people to be able to have those basic skills, because a lot of jobs, even if the jobs aren't writing or something along those lines, require some amount of knowing how to read and knowing how to write, and we don't want to lose that. I've mentioned before that I was a high school teacher for a few years, and I saw just how bad the problem is personally, and it was a little bit of a shock for me. In my opinion, that still doesn't explain why there are so few books in certain genres with older characters, because it seems like a lot of people from a lot of different age groups read and buy books. So making the majority of characters in certain genres in their 20s or in their teens feels a little silly to me. This is where I say all of this is a little bit of a generalization. I might be complaining about something that I feel being sort of a trend, but I have read plenty of books with older characters, and I did make a video with some of my recent reads that featured older characters, and I'll share that at the end of this video. Beyond just wanting to promote literacy for younger people, I do wonder if a lot of us are sort of just obsessed with our youth. We want to be youthful and we don't want to grow old. Youth worship. I wish I could say over-inclusion of younger people was a problem specific to the literary community, but that is obviously not true. There are a lot of movies that feature younger characters, and there are a lot of TV shows that feature younger characters. Also, when we see a lot of people become famous online, social media influencers, all of those sort of people, they tend to be younger. I think as a society, we've just been worshiping youth to an extent that doesn't fully make sense to me. Even that cultural practice where you meet someone or they want you to guess their age, and then you're supposed to sort of like look at them, take 5 years off of what you think is their age, and then give them that answer just to be safe. That's always been a little strange to me. I understand that there's a lot of cultural factors behind that, so I'm not saying that it's crazy. I'm just saying I've always thought the fact that a lot of people would rather be associated with a younger group than an older group a little strange, especially because I feel like I myself am a lot more of a developed person at my age, 29, than I was when I was 20, and I'm very proud of that, to be honest. Like, you should be improving as a person over time. You shouldn't be stuck wanting to be 22 again. On YouTube, I do watch a lot of booktube channels. I love to watch people start a channel where they're talking about books and about what they're reading, just because that's what I like. I'm a nerd for that. And I've seen more than one person, so multiple people, starting channels who are concerned about being older than the average booktuber. Someone that is like 35 years old will get on the camera and be like, I know I'm older than a lot of people on BookTube, but I wanted to join anyway, or something along those lines. And I've always found that so strange because first of all, I think there's a lot of people who do get on YouTube and talk about books who are older, and I think that is a positive thing. But I do think that oftentimes we see a lot of the younger people, whether it's some sort of social media literacy and how they edit their videos and are appealing to lots of people, or if it's just our societal bias towards youth, it does seem to be the case that a lot of channels that blow up include people who are a little bit younger or who were younger when they started their channel. However, the perception that a lot of people feel going into this, thinking that people will value the opinions of younger people over the opinions of people who have read longer, have read more books, and have more life experience, has always been strange to me, especially when we're talking specifically about books and book reviewing and things along those lines. I would almost rather, on average, have someone who is older to listen to than someone who has read 3 books and will happily recommend all of them. Of course, I myself am only 29, so I am likely shooting myself in the foot here. I probably should have waited a year to complain and make this video because, according to the Pew Research Center, I will be able to include myself in that older American group when I turn 30. However, given a lot of people do have large followings online, it kind of almost makes me wonder sometimes if that leads to a little bit of a bias into what should be published. Obviously, publishers want authors to make characters relatable, and if there is this perception that the majority of readers who are buying the majority of books are young and they can make things go viral and they can make books really popular, that might cause more books that are kind of targeted at a really young audience to be published and to have that sort of initial success. The assumption that the 17-year-old character is always relatable because we've all been 17 is not one that I like, and I'll talk about that in a second. However, in addition to all of these factors, another thing I wonder is if young characters are just easier to write and easier to incorporate into a story for many authors. The blank slate theory. I found this blog online called The Inspired Quill, and the author of this blog made a post about why she loves older characters being included in fiction and why she would like to see more of that. She makes this case that I find very interesting, but as I read what she said, I kind of wonder if what she was saying ironically described why many authors choose to write younger characters. She says, aged protagonists often have a rich backstory. Older characters are potentially more interesting than young ones because their decades of experience can facilitate a multi-layered plot. Several successful novels are structured around a character looking back at life. I honestly don't disagree with this. I think a lot of characters who have been through a lot of life, and also characters who have a certain amount of responsibilities, can create very complex plots because of who they are and because of what they as a person bring to the story. However, I also wonder if this is desirable. I can imagine an author who has a storyline in their head, who has an idea for a book. Maybe their book is a little bit plot focused, maybe they focused on the world building, they focused on what they want to happen, and then they have to kind of come up with characters for that story. It would seem easier on the surface to choose a younger character that doesn't have as many things to complicate what you're already trying to do. You can, for example, for a fantasy book, I think that's a perfect example of this, if you're trying to have your main character go on an adventure, it's nice if you can make their backstory simple, give them a really one-note motivation, and have them experience life and change and develop because of your story, not because of what they've already been through. And so I think that a lot of authors might choose to avoid people who are too complex to add to their stories because they don't want to have to do that multi-layered storytelling. In addition to this, I've also noticed that every time I have seen what people oftentimes describe as a self-insert character, which is basically a character written without much personality that you're supposed to be able to project yourself onto, it has been a younger character because it's harder to project your own feelings in your own life experience onto someone that you don't identify with. And I think that part of the choice sometimes that is being made to make a younger character the main character is the assumption that more people will be able to relate to a time in life that they personally have experience with. Having said all of that, I do personally think that the downsides to writing an older character from that perspective are actually the strengths of including an older character in your story. You do have to add layers to your story, and you do have to incorporate who they are as a person and who they have already become before your story begins. However, doing that makes your story a lot more complex, and it could, depending on execution, make your story a lot more compelling. A Reddit case. I found this writer on Reddit who is writing a fantasy novel, or was when she posted this. My Reddit posts are not always the most recent ones. Sometimes I choose ones that are the most relevant. I think this one might have been posted a year or two ago. She was talking about, in this post, how she was nervous about writing an older character because she was afraid the market wouldn't support her. She said, "What's the best age for a main character? So I've been planning on writing a story and have written a large chunk of it for a while now. I don't want to go into too much detail about the plot because for this post, it doesn't matter. However, it centers around a main character who is in her 40s. When I started writing, the main character was college age, but I ended up aging her up for a myriad of reasons. Maybe I just haven't read enough adult fiction, but I find that many characters in fantasy books are in their 20s. I think for a lot of the stories, that totally works, but for this story, I'd rather have her older than that. My hesitation from this is mostly the fact that I want to make her relatable. I haven't read a lot of books that center around a woman in her mid-40s, and I'm wondering what the reasoning behind that is. Are people more interested in stories with younger main characters? Obviously, this is a personal preference kind of question, but I would love to hear from other readers and writers alike. What are your thoughts on a female main character in her mid-40s? Now, I don't think that 40s are that old. I just want to say that first. But this does show that there are some writers who are nervous about portraying main characters that they think might become unmarketable because of their age. It's so interesting to me that the concept of relatability always comes up in these discussions. And I find it weird because it makes the assumption that you cannot relate to a character if they aren't exactly as you are or as you were. Of course, you can make the argument that when we read a book featuring a protagonist that is 19, most of us have been 19, and most of us have some memory of what it was like to be 19. However, if you were to make a main character that was 70 years old, most of us haven't been 70 years old, and we don't have personal experience regarding what it's like to be 70 years old. That being said, I don't think fiction was ever meant to be this vehicle for seeing yourself to that degree. A lot of people have begun using fiction to live out some sort of aspirational version of their own life, but I've always preferred to use fiction to consider the life experiences of other people. I don't think I need to be exactly like the main character for them to be relatable. If the writing is high quality enough, I should be able to relate as much as I need to understand the story and understand the perspective to even an 80-year-old man. That being said, many readers are above 40. And like I just barely mentioned, I don't think you should have to be a 40-year-old woman to be able to relate to a 40-year-old woman anyway. To be fair, many people responded to the Reddit poster fairly positively, saying that a middle-aged woman could make for a very compelling main character, even in a fantasy story where a lot of the characters tend to be younger. However, there were also some comments that sort of validated her concerns. One basically said, this sounds great and it could be a great book, but the reach of your book might be a little bit smaller because you are writing an older character. And then another commenter kind of took the more pessimistic side that I see a lot of people slipping into in the community. And they basically said, if you can't appeal to the TikTok girlies, your book is dead. Now, I think that a lot of people are exaggerating with the influence of TikTok to a certain extent. Sure, it is influential, and it's obviously a big piece of the reading community right now, and I actually don't think it is a net negative influence. I think it's getting a lot of people into reading who otherwise wouldn't be readers. That being said, if you assume that a book can't find an audience if it doesn't attract people on TikTok to repost it and make the book go viral, that just depresses me, and I really hope that's not true, and I think the more we believe that's true, the more we unintentionally make it true. What we lose. Slightly over 10 years ago, an older woman named Penelope Lively wrote an article for The Guardian where she just talked about her own experience with old age. She, I believe at the time of writing the article, was 80 years old, and one thing that she mentioned within this article was that she felt like she didn't have a blueprint for this stage of her life. One thing that she brought up is that our life expectancy, at least in certain countries, has gotten longer, and that part of her didn't even imagine that she would make it to the age that she made it to. She also kind of made the case that fiction wasn't helping. She said, "The stereotypes of old age run from the smiling old dear to the grumbling curmudgeon. In fiction, they are rife. Indeed, fiction is perhaps mainly responsible for the standard perception of the old, with just a few writers able to raise the game." So, in this part of her opinion piece, she makes the case that even when older characters are included in fiction, they aren't included very well, and she can't see herself in any of the characters that she reads, with a few exceptions. I'll link that article below if you want to read what exceptions she gave to her statements. She felt that a lot of these books that had older characters as side characters failed to humanize them and fail to see what it was actually like to be living life in your 70s and in your 80s. I think that there is likely some truth to her words, and I think that a lot of us try to avoid certain topics in life, especially those that make us uncomfortable, and while people are young, they don't like to think of what life will be like when they are older, but most of us are going to become older eventually. Of course, outside of that little discussion, what people mean when they say they want to see more older protagonists in books seems to vary widely. I've seen lots of women who enjoy romance novels who are just begging for a main lead to be 30 years old rather than 24. I've also seen a lot of people who have said things a little bit closer to what I have mentioned a little bit more in this video, where they want to see someone who has experienced enough life to bring some level of depth to the story. And sure, that could be a 30-year-old, but that could also be a 50-year-old or a 70-year-old. They want stories that portray these older characters, even if that might complicate the narrative and provide another layer to the story. My final thoughts. I don't think there's anything wrong with a younger protagonist. There's a lot of books that use them for a reason, and there's sort of like those coming-of-age tales that can be very impactful. I mean, I just, in a video, talked about Jane Eyre last week. Don't attempt a gotcha moment in a week if I hold up a book where the main character is 22 years old. I'm not saying that we shouldn't read all of those books. I love those books. All I'm saying is that we should expect and desire to read books that also include older protagonists. Maybe we can't personally relate on the same level to a character that is older than we are, but I don't think personally that fiction was always meant to be that easy where you just assumed that you were the main character. I think it's supposed to be widening your worldview by following the perspectives of other people, especially people that aren't like you. I will say on another note, if we always worship youth, what exactly do we have to look forward to? If we assume that the peak of life is 23, what are the rest of us doing? I think that having a healthy view of what you can do in your 30s and your 40s and your 50s and your 60s and your 70s and in your 80s, I feel like at this point I should say in your 90s, but I feel like it's getting ridiculous, is important. By including more characters and more stages of life, I think that we humanize life at all stages and also look forward to it more than if we constantly think about what it's like to be 17. If you missed my recent video where I talked about some books I recently read with older protagonists, I will link that here. And if you have an opinion on any of this, specifically what I'd be interested in hearing opinions on is if you feel like you have to be like a character to relate to them. Do you have to have had experiences similar to the main character in order to feel like the story is for you? Or can you follow a character that is nothing like you? That's what I'm really most interested about, so put that down in the comments, and thank you for watching.